Today, we become legends.
The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse: Pestilence, War, Famine, and Death, each embodying a key component to the destruction of the world in the Christian Book of Revelation. Should make for a really cool god concept, right? Before we start, I know that adding anything from Christianity is a bit controversial, but these are more mythological figures and not literally Jesus. Plus, we have deities that are still worshipped in modern times already in the game, so Christianity's exception feels like it exists mainly because Hi-Rez is an American company. Also, I know the more common name for Pestilence is actually Conquest, but that's very similar to War, and so to provide more distinctness and also avoid confusion with the game mode Conquest, I went with Pestilence instead. But with that said, let's jump in. So my idea for the Four Horsemen is to have them introduced as a single god with variations depending on which specific horseman you select in the lobby screen. They will have roughly the same kit with a few differences based on your choice of horseman. So first up, the passive Four Horsemen. Depending on your horseman of choice, you gain a unique effect on all your abilities. Pestilence gets a stacking damage over time poison effect on abilities. War stacks a damage increase aura around him when you hit abilities. Famine stacks a damage dealt debuff to enemies hit by your abilities. And Death gets bonus % missing health damage on your abilities like a soft execute. The Horseman will also have a hit chain of 1, 0.5, 0.5, 1.5 damage and swing time, with the last hit being a strong cleave. So this passive along with the ultimate are the only things that vary their effects based on your Horseman choice. The base kit remains the same no matter what. Each one has a very different effect and will change the way your horseman plays throughout the match. Pestilence will want to be constantly hitting enemies from range to apply his stacking poison. War will want to be in the thick of the fight around his allies to boost everyone's damage. Famine can neuter enemies by reducing their damage output, and Death will be very all in trying to get enemies low to get huge value from the missing health damage, but will be weaker against enemies at or near full health. So ability 1 is Divine Thrust. Your horseman enlarges his weapon and charges up a powerful thrust. After a short delay, he strikes in a line in front of him, damaging all enemies and silencing enemy gods for a very short duration. So due to the complexity in the passive and ultimate changing based on your horseman choice, I wanted to go with a fairly simple base kit, and your one is simply a charged up line damage attack with fairly low damage but also a very short cooldown. This will be great for stacking up the debuff or buff from Pestilence, Famine and War, while also being good for Death to proc the missing health damage very often. The silence on this is extremely short and more so meant to be an interrupt rather than an actual silence. This ability would also be your main wave and camp clear. Ability 2, Tactical Sweep. Your horseman swipes in front of him in a cone, damaging and knocking up enemies hit. He then follows up with a thrust to skewer enemy gods and slam them down in front, damaging them and all enemies in a small area. This will apply passive effects on each of the 3 hits. So this ability I just love and have a clear vision in my head of what the animation would look like in game. A powerful cleave swipes the enemy's legs, knocking them into the air while you reel back and skewer enemy gods hit, then slam them down to the ground in a kind of combo attack. This will apply the passive effect of your horseman 3 times, once on each hit, and will be your main CC ability in fights. It does great damage, but has a pretty long cooldown. Ability 3, Buck Slam. Your horse bucks you, throwing you off in the direction you were moving when this was cast. The horse bolts in the opposite direction, dealing damage and rooting enemies hit, while you perform a swift landing, dealing damage in a circular area around you, which also roots. Your horse then returns to you and you remount. This was quite a fun take on a movement ability, I feel. The horsemen will be permanently riding their specific colour horse throughout the match, but when they use the 3, the horse bucks them off, throwing them in a direction chosen similar to Rama's dash, where you land, dealing AoE damage and rooting enemies. The horse will then bolt in the exact opposite direction that you went, dealing damage to enemies it hits and rooting them as well. So you could use this for ranged poke or disengage by jumping off backwards and sending the horse forward to root enemies. You could jump forwards to engage and send the horse backwards to catch enemies behind you, and likewise from the side as well, which could catch one enemy with your landing and another with the horse in a hectic teamfight. After this, your horse rematerializes underneath you again and you can remount to continue gameplay. And finally, the big thing that changes depending on your horseman is the ultimate, Revelation. Your horseman charges off a powerful blast in a circular area around you, then explodes, dealing damage. Your horseman can cast other abilities while channeling this, and the effect of the charge and explosion differs based on your horseman choice. For Pestilence, the charge effect saps health from enemies around you every 0.5 seconds for the 3-second channel. Each hit applies Pestilence's poison from his passive. The final explosion then consumes all poison stacks on the targets, dealing their remaining damage as a burst and slowing enemies based on stacks consumed. For War, you gain damage mitigation and reflect a portion of damage dealt to you during the channeled effect and will tremble enemies for the 3-second duration. The final explosion effect also stuns enemies it hits if you are War. For Famine, during the 3-second channel, Famine tethers enemies in range. Enemy gods lose maximum health if they cast abilities while tethered. After the final explosion, Famine reduces his active cooldowns for every ability the enemy cast while tethered. And finally, for Death, Death swings his scythe around him during the channel, hitting 3 times with each hit and pulling enemies towards him and damaging them. The final explosion deals damage and executes any enemy god below 25% of their maximum health. So the ultimate is the only place other than the passive that your chosen horseman really affects what you are capable of, and this one definitely has a larger impact on your gameplay. The base ability is a simple channel then explosion around you, during which you can continue to basic attack or cast other abilities. Pestilence will sap the health of enemies during the channel to deal damage and then slow enemies based on the stacks of his specific passive poison when the final explosion happens. War, who is the most warrior-like of the 4, will gain mitigations, reflect damage, and tremble enemies during the channel, with the final explosion also stunning enemies for big AoE CC and teamfights. Famine interacts with cooldowns and enemy abilities by punishing enemies for casting while tethered to him during the channel, then refreshing his own cooldowns based on how many abilities were cast while tethered. And finally, Death pulls in all enemies during the channel and the explosion will execute enemies below 25% health. It only made thematical sense for the Horseman of Death to have an execute. These effects also combine pretty well with the passive of the given Horseman. Pestilence interacts with his poison stacks. War has strong CC and teamfight presence as he is more warrior-like. Famine reduces enemy damage with his passive, and when he ults, the enemy literally doesn't want to cast any abilities for fear of losing max health and refreshing Famine's cooldowns. And of course, Death has missing health damage on all of his abilities thanks to his passive and can finish off enemies with an execute from the ultimate. So overall, this design is fairly simple once you get to know what each of the specific horsemen does for your gameplay. The abilities themselves are very easy to use outside of maybe the 3 due to the strange nature of it. The depth here really comes from your choice of horseman. The god would be an assassin, but depending on your choice could fill a more warrior-like role, which War would probably be best at, and Famine might even have some support viability due to his passive damage reduction on enemies and ult that prevents enemies from casting abilities. As well as the horseman just generally having decent CC in the base kit with a knock-up in Skewer Slam and the root on the 3. While Pestilence and Death are much more standard assassin-like, with the former focusing more on sustained damage over time effects, while the latter focuses more on bursting people down and executing them. I think this variety in playstyle will make him really fun to play as you can somewhat customize how you want the character to be. I do recognise that it will be very hard to balance and keep all 4 horsemen viable at once. It would likely emerge that 1 or 2 specific ones would just be better than the rest, but with some careful balance to their specific differences and the fact that each one has a slightly different role to fill, could help in making each one feel good to play and not just strictly worse than any other specific one. As an assassin, the horseman will be made for jungle mainly, but I think would have very strong solo viability as well, pretty much on par with their jungle, due to strong wave clear from Divine Skewer and the cleave hit at the end of their chain. War would likely be the go-to for a solo lane horseman, but Famine has potential there as well, and you could even use Pestilence or Death as a full damage or bruiser option for solo. But what do you guys think of this concept? Is it a bit too much to learn when playing against the horseman, or would that trade-off be worth it for the cool flexibility this god could bring to the battleground? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.